What if I told you that the person sleeping next to you right now is planning your murder, that every kiss is a countdown, every promise, a lie, every gentle touch, a rehearsal for the moment they'll let you fall? Sarah Mitchell learned this truth on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, 7 months pregnant, begging for her life, watching her husband's face as he decided she wasn't worth keeping alive. He pushed her into the freezing water and walked away. He had 12 witnesses placing him somewhere else. He had a mistress waiting. He had a plan so perfect that when Sarah's body washed ashore the next morning, everyone would call it a tragic accident. But here's what he didn't plan for. Sarah Mitchell survived. And survival, as it turns out, is the most dangerous thing that could have happened to him. This is the story of a woman who fell from a cliff and climbed back up to destroy an empire. A story about the lies we tell ourselves about love, about the system that protects powerful men, and about what happens when the victim everyone thought was dead shows up to testify. I'm going to tell you how Sarah Mitchell went from drowning in the Pacific to putting her husband in federal prison, how she lost everything and built something stronger, how she learned that justice isn't a happy ending. It's just the beginning of survival. But I need to warn you, this story doesn't end the way you think it will, because real life rarely does. Stay with me for the next hour. This is a story you won't forget. Let's begin. The Pacific Ocean doesn't care about your story. It takes what falls into it and asks no questions. Detective Maria Torres stood on the rocky shore at dawn, watching the tide push something toward the rocks. Something that used to be a person. The body cam on her vest captured everything as two officers waded into the shallows, pulling the woman onto the sand. "Female, early 30s, one officer called out. "No obvious signs of trauma." Torres knelt beside the body. The woman's face was pale, lips blue but strangely peaceful, like she'd simply decided to go for a swim in the middle of the night and forgot to come back. "ID in her pocket," the second officer said, holding up a waterlogged wallet. "Sarah Mitchell. Address is about 2 miles up the coast road. Big estate overlooking the cliffs." Torres knew that address. Everyone in their small coastal town knew it. The Mitchell place was the kind of property that appeared in architecture magazines. Glass and steel and money. "Husband reported her missing yesterday evening," Torres said, checking her phone. "Derek Mitchell. Said she went for a walk and never came back." The medical examiner arrived, a brisk woman named Rachel Bennett, who'd seen too many bodies to be shocked by anything anymore. "Hypothermia, probably," Dr. Bennett said, checking the woman's extremities. "How long was she in the water?" "Based on the husband's timeline, at least 12 hours. Dr. Bennett frowned, pressing her fingers against Sarah Mitchell's neck. Then she went very still. "What?" Torres asked. "Get the ambulance here. Now. She's dead." "No," Dr. Bennett said, her voice sharp. "She's not." The officers scrambled. Torres watched as they loaded Sarah Mitchell onto a stretcher, as Dr. Bennett barked orders into her radio, as the ambulance screamed away toward County General. Torres stood alone on the beach, watching the sun rise over the water. Something didn't feel right about this. A woman doesn't walk 2 miles from her house to drown herself. Not accidentally. She pulled out her phone and dialed the Mitchell residence. "Mr. Mitchell, Detective Torres, I need you to come down to County General immediately. Your wife is alive." The silence on the other end of the line lasted just a beat too long. "What?" Derek Mitchell's voice cracked with emotion. Perfect grief. Perfect shock. "Oh my God. Is she okay?" "I'm coming right now." Torres ended the call and stared at her phone. That pause, that tiny hesitation before he responded. 20 years as a cop had taught her to trust her instincts. And her instincts were screaming that Derek Mitchell had expected very different news. At County General Hospital, Derek Mitchell sat in the waiting room with his head in his hands. He wore expensive casual clothes, the kind that looked effortless but cost more than most people's monthly rent. His dark hair was perfectly styled even in crisis. His watch caught the fluorescent lights. Torres watched him through the glass partition. He looked up, saw her, and his face transformed into desperate hope. "Detective, how is she? Can I see her?" "She's in intensive care. Severe hypothermia, possible internal injuries. The doctors are working on her now." "I don't understand how this happened." Derek's voice broke. "She said she needed air. I was on a conference call with investors. I looked up and she was gone." "What time was that?" "Around 7:30 last night. I called you at 9 when I couldn't find her. Torres made a note. 12 hours in the Pacific in October. The woman should be dead. Mr. Mitchell, does your wife have any history of depression, suicidal ideation? His eyes widened. What, no? Sarah would never? She's pregnant. We're having a baby. She was excited about it. Past tense, Torres noted. Was excited. I'll need to speak with her when she wakes up, Torres said. Of course. Anything. Derek reached out and gripped her arm. Thank you for finding her. Thank you for bringing my wife back to me. His hand was cold. His eyes were dry. Torres pulled away and walked toward the ICU, a question forming in her mind that she couldn't quite shake. What kind of husband doesn't cry when his wife almost dies? 3 days earlier, Sarah Mitchell had been happy, or at least, she'd been very good at pretending. She stood in the nursery of their coastal estate, one hand on her rounded belly, the other holding a paintbrush. Soft yellow covered 3 walls. The 4th wall remained white, waiting for Derek's approval of the color choice. It's too bright, Derek said from the doorway. Sarah turned and forcing a smile. The designer said yellow promotes happiness and creativity. The designer works for us, not the other way around. He crossed the room, took the paintbrush from her hand. You should be resting anyway. That's what we pay staff for. I wanted to do this myself, for our baby. Derek kissed her forehead, but his eyes remained cold. Our baby will have everything we didn't, including parents who make smart decisions. After he left, Sarah stood alone in the half-painted room. She'd quit her job as an investigative journalist 18 months ago. Derek said the stress wasn't good for starting a family. He said they didn't need the money. He said a lot of things that sounded like love but felt like chains. She'd sold her apartment, closed her office, and moved into his world of glass and steel overlooking the Pacific. At first, it felt like a fairy tale. Then she started noticing the small things, how he chose her clothes, how he scheduled her days, how her phone always seemed to know where she was. The breaking point came 2 weeks before she ended up in the ocean. Sarah couldn't sleep. The baby was pressing on her bladder constantly at 7 months, and at 2 in the morning, she gave up trying to rest. She walked downstairs for water and saw light spilling from Derek's study. His voice carried through the half-open door, low and intense. I told you, it's handled. Once she's out of the picture, everything transfers to me. The prenup is ironclad. No, she doesn't suspect anything. She's too busy nesting. Sarah's blood went cold. She pressed herself against the wall, her phone clutched in her trembling hand. Claire, baby, trust me. This is the last obstacle. After this, we're free. You, me, and enough money to disappear anywhere we want. Claire, his business partner, the woman who smiled at Sarah over conference tables and asked about her pregnancy with false concern. I've already made the arrangements, Derek continued. It'll look like an accident. Postpartum depression, tragic fall, happens all the time. No one will question it. Sarah's hands shook as she opened her phone's recording app. She barely breathed as she captured every word. The insurance alone is $5 million, plus the company assets, the properties, all of it. We just need to be patient a little longer. Nature will take its course. Nature? He meant her baby. He was going to wait until she gave birth, then kill her and take everything. Sarah crept back upstairs, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might wake the whole house. She locked herself in the bathroom and played the recording back, making sure every word was clear. It was all of it. His voice, his plan, his casual discussion of her murder. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something other than trapped. She felt angry, and anger, she remembered, was what made her a good journalist. Anger made you dig. Anger made you find the truth. She spent the next week pretending everything was normal. She smiled at Derek's morning kisses. She attended Claire's presentations at the company office. She let them think she was oblivious. But at night, while Derek slept beside her, Sarah investigated. She found encrypted files on his laptop. Financial records that showed his tech company was a shell game, moving investor money in circles to hide the fact that the actual product didn't exist. A Ponzi scheme dressed in Silicon Valley buzzwords. She found hotel receipts, hundreds of them. Derek and Claire had been together for over a year, since before Sarah quit her job. Maybe that was the real reason he wanted her to quit. Easier to hide an affair when your wife isn't asking questions. She found emails between Derek and someone named Marcus. Short, coded messages. But Sarah had spent years investigating white-collar crime. She knew how to read between lines. Marcus was Derek's insurance policy. The man who would push her off the cliff when the time came. Have you ever realized that the person you trusted most in the world is actually your executioner? That the hands that held you were always planning to let you go? It changes something fundamental inside you. It makes you understand that survival isn't about being good or kind or trusting. It's about being willing to do what others won't. Sarah Mitchell learned this lesson too late, but she learned it. On the day Derek took her to the cliffs, Sarah knew what was coming. She saw it in the way he insisted they go for an evening walk, the way he chose the most isolated trail, the way he positioned himself between her and the path back. What she didn't know was that she'd already lost. Sarah woke to fluorescent lights and the smell of disinfectant. Every part of her body screamed with pain. Her head pounded, her ribs felt like broken glass, and her stomach felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. "Mrs. Mitchell, can you hear me?" A nurse leaned over her, checking monitors. "You're in County General. You've been through significant trauma." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was raw from salt water. She managed one word, "Baby." The nurse's face said everything before her words did. "I'm so sorry. The fetus didn't survive. We did everything we could." The room tilted. Sarah closed her eyes, but that made it worse. Behind her eyelids, she saw Derek's face on the cliff, his hand on her shoulder. The push. "My husband," she croaked. "He pushed me. He's here. He's been waiting all night. Should I get him?" "No." Sarah gripped the nurse's arm. "He tried to kill me. You have to call the police." The nurse's expression shifted from sympathy to concern. The wrong kind of concern. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've suffered a major trauma, both physical and psychological. Let me get Dr. Bennett." 15 minutes later, Dr. Bennett sat beside Sarah's bed, speaking in that careful tone medical professionals use with patients they think might be unstable. "Sarah, you lost a lot of blood. You were in hypothermic shock. Your body has been through an incredible ordeal. Sometimes after severe trauma, memories can become confused." "I'm not confused. My husband pushed me off a cliff because he wants my money and he's sleeping with his business partner." Dr. Bennett exchanged a look with the nurse. "Let's talk about what happened. Can you tell me the last thing you clearly remember?" "Everything. I remember going for a walk with Derek. I remember standing at the cliff edge. I remember him pushing me. I remember falling into the water and trying to swim. I remember thinking I was going to die." "And your husband says you went for a walk alone. He was on a video conference with 12 other people when you disappeared. We verified that." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "What?" "Mr. Mitchell has a verifiable alibi. He was in his office on a call with investors from 7:15 until 8:45. Your phone's GPS shows you left the house at 7:30 and walked toward the cliffs, alone." Sarah's mind raced. That was impossible. She was with Derek. She felt his hands on her. Unless it wasn't Derek. "Marcus," she whispered. "Who?" "The man he hired. Derek hired someone to push me. He was on the call to create an alibi." Dr. Bennett's expression grew more concerned. "Sarah, I need to ask you some questions. Have you been experiencing any unusual thoughts lately? Paranoia, maybe feeling like people are watching you?" "I'm not crazy. No one said you were. But postpartum psychosis is a real condition. Even though you lost the baby, your hormones are still adjusting. Combined with the trauma, I have proof." Sarah tried to sit up, gasping as pain shot through her ribs. "My phone. There's a recording. I recorded Derek talking about killing me." "Your phone was destroyed in the water. We recovered it from your pocket. But it's not functional." The room spun. Sarah lay back, tears streaming down her face. Every piece of evidence she'd gathered, every careful plan, gone. "I want to speak to Detective Torres," Sarah said. "Of course, she's been waiting to talk to you." Detective Torres entered the room like she owned it, all business and sharp eyes. She pulled up a chair beside Sarah's bed and opened a notebook. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to walk me through everything that happened yesterday." Sarah told her. All of it. The recording, The investigation, Derek's plan, Claire's involvement, Marcus the hired killer. Torres wrote it all down without commenting. When Sarah finished, the detective closed her notebook and met her eyes. Mrs. Mitchell, do you have any evidence to support these claims? It was on my phone, but Derek had spyware installed. He's been monitoring everything. If he had spyware on your phone, we can verify that. We'll get a forensic analysis. Hope flickered in Sarah's chest. Thank you. Thank you for believing me. Torres hesitated. Mrs. Mitchell, I have to be honest with you. Your husband has an airtight alibi. 12 witnesses place him in his office during the time you went missing. There's no evidence of this Marcus person, no financial records of any payment, and the recording you mentioned is gone because he destroyed it. Maybe, or maybe you were under extreme stress, and your mind created a narrative to explain what happened. I'm not making this up. I'm not saying you are. I'm saying that from where I'm sitting, this looks like a woman who was overwhelmed and maybe tried to hurt herself. I didn't try to kill myself. I would never. I wanted that baby. Torres stood. I'll investigate. I promise you that. But right now, there's nothing I can arrest your husband for. He's downstairs right now, asking when he can see you. What do you want me to tell him? Sarah stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her new reality. Derek had won. He'd planned everything perfectly. And now she was the crazy wife who tried to kill herself and her baby. Tell him I'm resting, Sarah whispered. Tell him I'll see him soon. After Torres left, Sarah lay alone in the sterile hospital room, her hand on her empty stomach. She thought about her baby, the life that was supposed to start in 2 months. She thought about the nursery with its half-painted walls. And she thought about Derek, downstairs playing the devoted husband for the cameras. He'd taken everything, her career, her friends, her independence, her baby. And now he'd taken her credibility. But he'd made one mistake. He'd left her alive. And Sarah Mitchell remembered something her first editor told her years ago. The best investigative journalism happens when everyone thinks you're beaten. That's when people get sloppy. Derek thought he'd won. He was wrong. This was just the opening round. 3 days later, Sarah signed herself out of the hospital against medical advice. She had nowhere else to go, no family nearby, no friends she hadn't lost to Derek's gradual isolation. Her bank accounts were joint. Her car was in Derek's name. Even her phone plan belonged to him. She had two choices, a homeless shelter or the house where her husband had plotted her murder. Derek arrived to pick her up in his Tesla, all concerned smiles and gentle touches. He held her arm like she might break. He opened doors. He played the part perfectly. I'm so glad you're coming home, he said as they drove up the coastal highway. The house has been empty without you. Sarah watched the ocean through the window. Somewhere out there was the cliff where she'd fallen, where someone had pushed her. I don't remember much, she lied. Dr. Bennett says that's normal with trauma. Derek's shoulders relaxed slightly. That's probably for the best. Some things are better left forgotten. The house looked exactly the same. Glass and steel and carefully curated wealth. Sarah walked through rooms that no longer felt like hers. In the nursery, the yellow paint had been covered with white. All the baby furniture was gone. I thought it would be easier, Derek said from the doorway, if you didn't have to see reminders. How thoughtful. That night, Sarah lay in bed beside the man who tried to kill her. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every sound made her jump. Every movement made her wonder if this was when he'd finish what he started. But Derek just slept peacefully, his breathing steady, like he didn't have a care in the world. At 3 a.m, Sarah slipped out of bed and went downstairs to Derek's study. She needed evidence, something concrete, something Torres could actually use. The study door was locked now. It never had been before. Sarah picked the lock with a bobby pin, a skill she'd learned covering a story about burglaries years ago. The door clicked open. Derek's laptop sat on his desk, password protected. But Sarah knew his passwords. She'd watched him type them 100 times. She logged in and started searching. The encrypted files were gone. The emails to Marcus had been deleted, but Derek wasn't as careful as he thought. Sarah knew how to recover deleted data. It took an hour, but she found them. Not the originals, but fragments in the system cache, partial emails, pieces of financial transfers, enough to show a pattern. if not quite enough to prove murder for hire. She transferred everything to a thumb drive she found in the desk drawer. Then she searched for the spyware Torres mentioned, found it, deleted it, installed her own monitoring software that would send her copies of everything Derek did on this computer. If he was going to watch her, she'd watch him right back. Sarah was erasing her digital footprints when she heard it. A floorboard creaking upstairs, then another, footsteps in the hallway. She closed the laptop, pocketed the thumb drive, and slipped out of the study just as Derek appeared at the top of the stairs. "Sarah, what are you doing up? Couldn't sleep. Went for water." He came down the stairs slowly, his eyes moving from her to the study door and back. "That door was closed. It was open. I didn't touch anything. The study is off limits. You know that." "Since when?" "Since you started having episodes." His voice hardened. "The doctors said you need structure, rules, for your own protection." Sarah felt the thumb drive burning in her pocket. If he searched her now, found it. "You're right," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I'm still confused about some things." Derek's expression softened. He pulled her into a hug that made her skin crawl. "It's okay, baby. We'll get through this together. But you need to trust me." "Can you do that?" Sarah nodded against his chest, fighting the urge to run. "I trust you." That was the moment she understood the full scope of what she was facing. Derek wasn't just trying to kill her. He was trying to make everyone believe she was losing her mind first. That way, when she died, it would look like suicide. Inevitable. Tragic. Blameless. The next morning, Sarah called the only person she thought might believe her. Evan Hart, her former editor at the Bay Area Tribune. The man who taught her everything she knew about investigating the powerful. "Evan, it's Sarah Mitchell." Silence. Then, "Sarah, I heard about what happened. I'm so sorry about the baby. I need your help. Of course, anything." She told him everything. The recording, the fall, Derek's alibi, the evidence she'd just stolen. Evan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, what you're describing is a very serious accusation against a very wealthy man. I know. If you're wrong, he'll destroy you." "I'm not wrong." Another pause. Then, "Okay, I believe you. Send me what you found. I'll start digging." For the first time since waking up in the hospital, Sarah felt like she could breathe. She wasn't alone anymore. She sent Evan the files from the thumb drive. He called back an hour later. "This is good, but it's not enough. We need the man. Marcus. If Derek hired him, there's a paper trail somewhere. Bank records, phone records, something. How do we find him?" "Leave that to me. I still have contacts at the Tribune. People who know how to track information that doesn't want to be found." Over the next week, Sarah played the perfect recovering wife. She went to therapy appointments Derek scheduled. She took the medication he handed her. She smiled and nodded and pretended to believe his concern was real. And at night, she worked. She and Evan built a case, piece by piece. They found Marcus through a shell company Derek had created 3 years ago. They found bank transfers disguised as consulting fees. They found cell phone records showing Marcus in the area the night Sarah fell. They found evidence of Claire's affair with Derek going back 18 months. Hotel rooms charged to company accounts. Jewelry purchases. Even a property in Napa they'd bought together under false names. "This is it," Evan said over a secure call. "This is enough to take to the police. What if Torres doesn't believe me? Then we go over her head, FBI, state investigators, whoever will listen. Sarah, you've done it. You've built a real case." For the first time in weeks, Sarah let herself hope. That night, she arranged to meet Marcus through an encrypted message Evan helped her send. Marcus agreed, probably thinking Derek had sent it. They'd meet at a warehouse in Oakland at midnight. Evan would bring recording equipment. Sarah would get Marcus to confess on tape. Finally, she'd have the proof no one could dismiss. She should have known it was too easy. The Oakland warehouse district was the kind of place decent people avoided after dark. Sarah and Evan sat in his car, watching the empty building across the street. "You sure he's coming?" Evan asked. "He confirmed 30 minutes ago." "And you're sure this is Marcus, not some trap Derek set?" Sarah wasn't sure of anything anymore, but she needed this. She needed someone to believe her. At 11:58, a figure appeared in the shadows. Tall, thin, nervous energy. He looked around like he expected police to jump out from every corner. "That's him," Sarah said. "The description matches Derek's emails." "Okay, you stay here. I'll go talk to him." "No, it has to be me. He needs to see I'm alive. Maybe that'll shake him." Before Evan could argue, Sarah stepped out of the car. She crossed the empty street, her footsteps echoing. Marcus turned, saw her, and his face went white. "You're supposed to be dead," he said. Those 4 words were everything. Sarah pulled out her phone and hit record. "Derek Mitchell hired you to push me off the cliff. Yes or no?" Marcus took a step back. "I don't know what you're talking about. I have emails. I have bank transfers. I know he paid you $50,000. I know you were at the cliff that night. Just tell the truth." "Lady, you're confused. I do construction work for Mr. Mitchell. That's all. You tried to kill me. I didn't touch you." Marcus's voice rose. "Derek said you were crazy, and he was right." Sarah moved closer. Behind her, Evan was recording everything with a camera from the car. They just needed Marcus to admit it. One clear confession. "Derek's going to throw you away the minute you're not useful," Sarah said. "You think he's your friend. He's using you. When this all falls apart, you're the one who'll go to prison. Not him." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Fear. Recognition. "He said no one would get hurt," Marcus whispered. "He said you were sick, that you'd be better off, that he'd make sure I was protected." "Get it on record," Sarah said softly. "Tell me what he hired you to do. I'll help you. We can both testify against him." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Okay, yeah, I'll tell you everything. Derek Mitchell paid me to..." The gunshot cut through the night like thunder. Marcus stumbled backward, a red bloom spreading across his chest. He looked down at the wound, then at Sarah, confusion in his eyes. "Run!" he gasped. Then he collapsed. Sarah screamed. Evan was out of the car, pulling her back toward safety. Another shot rang out, shattering the car window. They dove behind the vehicle as bullets tore through the air above them. "Call 911!" Evan yelled, already on his phone. Sarah crouched behind the tire, shaking. Across the street, Marcus lay motionless. The shooter had vanished into the shadows. Police arrived in 7 minutes, paramedics in 9. But Marcus was already gone, his confession dying with him. Detective Torres showed up 20 minutes later, taking in the scene with hard eyes. "You want to tell me what you were doing in Oakland at midnight?" she asked Sarah. "Meeting a witness? Marcus? He was the man Derek hired to kill me. And now he's dead?" "Yes." Torres looked at the body, then back at Sarah. "This is the second time someone has died in connection with you, Mrs. Mitchell. That's starting to look like a pattern." The implication hit Sarah like a slap. "You think I killed him? I think you've been making serious accusations without evidence. I think you arranged to meet a man in a deserted area, and I think that man is now dead. Someone shot him. Someone who wanted to silence him before he could testify. Or someone wanted to frame your husband for a murder he didn't commit." Sarah stared at Torres in disbelief. "You can't be serious. Mr. Mitchell has been very cooperative with our investigation. He's answered every question. He's provided access to all his financial records. He's done everything a concerned husband would do." Torres closed her notebook. "You, on the other hand, have been engaging in what looks a lot like harassment, breaking into his study, making recordings without consent, luring witnesses to isolated locations. I'm the victim here. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been building a case against a man who's done nothing but try to help you." Evans stepped forward. "Detective, we have evidence that Derek Mitchell was paying Marcus. You have fragments of data that could mean anything. You have circumstantial connections that don't prove murder for hire. What you don't have is a single piece of concrete evidence that holds up in court." Torres walked away, leaving Sarah standing in the crime scene tape, watching them bag Marcus's body. Her recording of his partial confession inadmissible. He didn't finish the sentence. A good lawyer could argue he was about to say something completely innocent. The bank transfers could be legitimate construction work. The cell phone records proved Marcus was in the area. But not that he'd pushed Sarah. Every piece of evidence she'd gathered was just circumstantial enough to be worthless. Sarah sat in Evan's car as dawn broke over Oakland. He's going to get away with it. No, we keep digging. We find something else. There is nothing else. Evan. He's covered every angle. Marcus was the key, and now Marcus is dead. Then we go public. I still have friends at the Tribune. We publish what we have. Let the court of public opinion decide. Sarah looked at her old editor. This man who'd risked everything to help her. If we do that, Derek will sue us both into oblivion, and he'll win. They sat in silence, watching the police process the scene. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Derek. Heard about what happened in Oakland. Please come home. I'm worried about you. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the phone into the bay. Instead, she typed back, on my way, because she had nowhere else to go. No evidence strong enough to use. No allies powerful enough to help. Derek had won again, and this time, someone had died to ensure his victory. 2 weeks after Marcus's murder, something impossible happened. Detective Torres called Sarah and said words she'd stopped believing she'd ever hear. We have enough to arrest your husband. Sarah sat in the safe house police had provided, her hands trembling as Torres laid out the case. We found the smoking gun, Torres said. Literally. Ballistics matched the bullet that killed Marcus to a gun registered to Claire Russo. We also found financial records showing Derek made a $200,000 wire transfer to an account in the Caymans the day after you fell from the cliff. And we have testimony from one of Derek's former employees who says Derek asked about ways to make a death look accidental. So you believe me now? Torres had the decency to look uncomfortable. I should have believed you sooner. I'm sorry. That night, Sarah watched the news coverage from her safe house. Cameras captured Derek being led from his office in handcuffs, his perfect composure finally cracking. He looked directly at the camera and said, "This is a misunderstanding. I love my wife." Claire was arrested simultaneously at her apartment. The affair was now public. The scheme was exposed. The news called it the perfect crime that unraveled. For 3 days, Sarah felt something she'd forgotten existed: safety. Derek was in custody. Claire was in custody. The nightmare was ending. She met with the district attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Reeves, who promised her that Derek would face justice. We have him, Reeves said. Multiple counts: conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, murder in the first degree for Marcus. He's looking at life without parole. Sarah allowed herself to hope. She started writing again, documenting everything that had happened. Evan promised to help her publish it once the trial was over. She began seeing a therapist, actually processing the trauma instead of just surviving it. Maybe, she thought, life could start again. Then, 48 hours after his arrest, Derek was released. Sarah watched in disbelief as the news anchor explained, all charges against Tech CEO Derek Mitchell have been dropped due to prosecutorial misconduct. Sources say Detective Maria Torres violated procedure in obtaining evidence, making it inadmissible in court. Her phone rang. Torres. Sarah, I'm so sorry. They're saying I overstepped, that I contaminated the evidence. Derek's lawyers got everything thrown out. Now, what about the gun? What about the Cayman account? The gun was in Claire's name, but there's no evidence Derek knew about it. The wire transfer was to a legitimate business account. His lawyers have explanations for everything. And the former employee, recanted, says Derek's legal team threatened her. She's too scared to testify. Sarah sank onto the couch, the phone falling from her hand. On the television, Derek stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by lawyers, making a statement. I'm devastated by what my wife has been through, he said, his voice steady and sincere. But these false accusations have torn our lives apart. I hope Sarah gets the mental health help she clearly needs. The reporters ate it up. Concerned husband, unstable wife, tale as old as time. But it got worse. Derek's lawyers filed a restraining order against Sarah, filed defamation charges, claimed she'd orchestrated a harassment campaign against him. Social media exploded with takes: gold digger, crazy woman, liar. Someone leaked Sarah's therapy records, showing she'd been diagnosed with trauma-induced anxiety and depression. The internet decided that proved she was making everything up. Claire held a press conference where she cried and said Sarah had always been jealous of her professional relationship with Derek. I should have seen the sign, Claire said, but I never imagined she'd go this far. Public opinion turned like a light switch. Sarah became the villain in her own story. The safe house she had to leave. She had no grounds to stay in protective custody when the person she needed protection from was the victim of her harassment. Her bank accounts, still frozen, now legally, as Derek's lawyers fought to prove she'd stolen from him during their marriage. Her friends, the few who'd started to believe her, now backed away. No one wanted to be associated with someone the news called unstable, vindictive, dangerous. Evan tried to help. He published a piece at an alternative news site laying out the evidence. It got 47 views. Meanwhile, Derek's interview on cable news got 3 million. Sarah had to move back to her car, the same car she'd slept in before, this time with even less hope. Have you ever felt like the world decided who you are, and nothing you say or do can change their minds? That's the special hell of being a woman no one believes. Every word you speak becomes proof of your instability. Every action you take becomes evidence of your guilt. The truth doesn't matter when everyone has already chosen their narrative. One night, parked at a rest stop off Highway 1, Sarah sat in her car and thought about the cliff. How easy it would be to drive there, to finish what Derek had started. She'd lost everything. Her baby, her credibility, her safety, her future. What was left? Then her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh. I've been investigating Derek Mitchell for securities fraud for 18 months. We need to talk. Sarah stared at the message, afraid to believe it was real, afraid it was another trap, afraid to hope. But what choice did she have? She called the number. Agent Walsh answered on the first ring. Miss Mitchell, I can't promise I can help you with the attempted murder case, but I can promise that if you help me prove Derek's company is a fraud, he'll go to federal prison for a very long time. Interested, Sarah looked out at the dark highway, at the ocean beyond, at the place where she'd almost died. Tell me what you need me to do. Agent Jennifer Walsh was nothing like Detective Torres. Where Torres had been skeptical and cautious, Walsh was direct and calculating. She met Sarah at a coffee shop in San Francisco, far from the coastal town where Derek's influence reached. Derek Mitchell's company, Apex Technologies, is a house of cards, Walsh said, spreading documents across the table. We've been tracking it for a year and a half, but we can't prove fraud without internal evidence. That's where you come in. You want me to go back to him? I want you to play a role. The defeated wife? You go back. You apologize. You give him what he wants, complete control. And while you're doing that, you wear a wire and get him to talk about the real state of his company. Sarah's hands shook around her coffee cup. He'll kill me. Not if he thinks he's already won. Men like Derek are arrogant. They can't resist gloating when they think they're untouchable. What if he finds the wire? We'll use technology he can't detect, and we'll have agents nearby at all times. The second you're in danger, we extract you. Sarah thought about the alternatives. Living in her car, running for the rest of her life, or fighting back with the only weapon she had left, Derek's ego. What happens if I get you the evidence? Federal charges, wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy. He's looking at 25 years minimum in federal prison, and federal charges mean no bail, no local judges he can influence, no way out. And the attempted murder. Walsh's expression softened. That's harder, but if we can prove he's a criminal, it changes the narrative. People might start believing you. Might, not will, but might was better than nothing. Okay, Sarah said. Tell me what to do. The plan was simple in theory, devastating in practice. Sarah had to go back to Derek and convince him she was broken. Convince him she believed his version of events. Convince him she just wanted peace. It took 3 weeks to set up. Walsh's team prepared Sarah like an actress preparing for a role. They taught her how to hide her emotions, how to seem defeated while staying alert, how to trigger Derek's need to prove his superiority. Men like him need to feel powerful, Walsh explained. He won't be satisfied just winning. He needs you to acknowledge that you lost. The day Sarah went back to Derek, she dressed carefully. Simple clothes, no makeup, hair pulled back. She looked tired because she was tired. She looked defeated because she was defeated. The only difference was that this time, she was choosing to look that way. Derek answered the door of the house that used to be hers. He looked surprised, then cautious. "Sarah, can we talk?" He let her in. They sat in the living room where they'd once hosted dinner parties, where they'd once pretended to be happy. "You were right," Sarah said, the words tasting like poison. "About everything. I was paranoid. I was unstable. I blamed you for things that weren't your fault." Derek studied her face. "What changed?" "I got help. Real help. I'm on medication now. I'm seeing a therapist 3 times a week, and I'm starting to see how sick I was. You accused me of terrible things. I know, I'm so sorry. Derek, I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, and I wanted to ask if maybe, possibly, we could work out a divorce settlement that doesn't destroy both of us." She saw the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of options. Could she still be a threat? Was this surrender real? "What kind of settlement?" "I don't want money. I don't want the house. I just want enough to start over somewhere far away. Maybe a small apartment fund. And I'll sign an NDA. I'll never speak about what happened again." Derek leaned back, a small smile playing at his lips. This was what he wanted. Her groveling, her broken. "That seems reasonable," he said. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah played her part perfectly. She came to the house for settlement discussions. She was quiet, agreeable, grateful for any scraps Derek offered. She never argued. She never challenged. And while she did this, she wore a wire that captured every conversation. The breakthrough came on day 12. Derek was in his study, feeling generous after Sarah agreed to sign away any claim to his company. He poured himself whiskey and actually talked to her like a human being for the first time in months. "You know what's funny," he said. "Everyone thinks Apex is the next big thing. They have no idea there's nothing there. No product, no innovation, just me, moving money around and making it look like growth." Sarah's heart pounded, but she kept her voice casual. "That must be stressful." "It's genius. I learned it from watching other tech CEOs. They all do it. Promise the moon. Fake it until you make it. Cash out before anyone realizes it's smoke." "What about the investors?" Derek laughed. "They're greedy. They see the returns on paper and they don't ask questions. By the time they figure it out, I'll have liquidated everything and disappeared." Hunt with Claire. His face hardened slightly. "Claire's useful, smart, good at selling the lie. But yeah, we'll probably end up somewhere without extradition treaties." "What about me? What was I?" Derek looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment she saw the truth behind his mask. "You were the perfect cover. Successful journalist marries tech CEO, settles down, starts a family, made me look stable, trustworthy. Then you got pregnant and started asking questions, and you became a liability. So you decided to get rid of me. I decided to solve a problem. Nothing personal. Sarah, just business." Every word was recorded, every admission captured by the FBI equipment hidden in her clothes. 3 days later, Walsh made her move. The raid happened during an investor meeting at Apex headquarters. Federal agents swept in with warrants, seizing computers, documents, everything. Derek tried to run but was caught in the parking garage. Claire was arrested at her condo in Pacific Heights. This time, there were no local police who could be influenced. No judges Derek's lawyers could manipulate. Just federal law, cold and impartial. Sarah watched it all from a surveillance van with Walsh. "You did it," Walsh said. "You just took down a $20 million fraud scheme." Sarah should have felt victorious. She should have felt relief. Instead, she just felt empty. "Will this be enough?" she asked. "Will anyone believe me now about what he did?" Walsh was honest. "The attempted murder is still your word against his, but now he's a proven criminal. That changes things, and juries don't like men who defraud investors and cheat on their wives." It wasn't everything Sarah wanted, but it was something. That night, Derek called her from jail, his one permitted phone call. She answered. "You think you've won," he said, "but you haven't. I'll get the best lawyers. I'll fight this. And when I get out, you'll regret crossing me." Sarah smiled, a real smile for the first time in months. "Derek, you're going to federal prison for wire fraud and securities fraud. The FBI has recordings of you confessing to running a Ponzi scheme. You're not getting out. Not for decades. They'll never convict me. They will, because I wore a wire for 2 weeks and you told me everything. Your ego wouldn't let you stay quiet when you thought you'd won. The silence on the other end was worth everything she'd been through. Goodbye, Derek, Sarah said. I hope prison gives you time to think about the lives you destroyed. She hung up and blocked his number. It wasn't justice for her baby. It wasn't justice for what he tried to do to her. But it was something. And sometimes, something is all you get. 6 months later, Sarah sat in a federal courtroom watching Derek Mitchell face the consequences of his actions. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Walsh had built an overwhelming case. The prosecution presented the recordings Sarah had made, showing Derek admitting to fraud, to the affair, to viewing Sarah as a liability he needed to eliminate. They showed financial records proving Apex Technologies had no real product, just clever accounting that moved investor money in circles. Claire testified against Derek in exchange for a reduced sentence. She admitted the affair. She admitted helping him deceive investors. And in a moment that made Sarah's heart stop, she admitted that Derek had talked about getting rid of his wife. He said she was asking too many questions, Claire testified. He said it would be easier if she just disappeared. Derek's lawyers tried everything. They argued Sarah had manipulated the recordings. They claimed the FBI had entrapped him. They painted Sarah as a vengeful ex-wife with no credibility. But federal prosecutors don't bring cases they can't win, and Agent Walsh had built something bulletproof. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Derek's face went white when the verdict was read. He truly believed he would walk free, that his money and lawyers and charm would save him. At sentencing, Sarah was allowed to speak. She stood before the judge and told her story. Not about the fraud, but about the marriage, about the isolation, about being pushed from a cliff while pregnant. I can't prove he tried to kill me, she said. The evidence isn't there, but I know what happened. I know what I survived, and I know that this man is capable of destroying lives without remorse. The judge listened. Then he sentenced Derek to 25 years in federal prison. Claire got 15 years for her cooperation. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed as Sarah. For the first time, some of them were asking if maybe she'd been telling the truth all along, if maybe Derek really had tried to kill her. It wasn't vindication, but it was something. Evan met her on the courthouse steps. How do you feel? Tired, Sarah admitted. Really tired. You won. Did I? Derek's in prison, but my baby is still gone. My career is still destroyed, and half the internet still thinks I'm a liar. The other half is starting to believe you. Sarah looked out at the city, at the baby on, at the world that had nearly swallowed her whole. I don't care about being believed anymore. Evan, I just want to survive. That night, Sarah stood on the cliff where it all began, the place where someone pushed her into the ocean, where her old life ended and this strange new existence began. She'd come here once a week since Derek's arrest, just to stand at the edge and remind herself that she'd fallen and survived, that survival was enough. The ocean crashed below, indifferent and eternal. The wind cut through her jacket. She stood with her toes at the edge, looking down at the water that had tried to claim her. And she stepped back. Not today. Not ever again. A year after Derek's conviction, Sarah Mitchell sat in a small office in downtown Oakland. The sign on the door read, Survivor Support Services, and listed her name as director. She'd used the divorce settlement, smaller than she deserved but enough, to start a nonprofit helping women escape dangerous relationships. Women who knew what it felt like to not be believed. Women who understood that survival sometimes meant losing everything first. Her first client was a woman named Jennifer, whose husband had pushed her down the stairs and convinced everyone it was an accident. Sarah knew that story. She knew how to help Jennifer gather evidence, how to find allies, how to fight back without getting killed. Evan stopped by her office every few weeks, bringing coffee and updates on their investigative journalism project. They were writing a book together about Derek's case, about white-collar crime and domestic violence, and the intersection of power and abuse. Publishers are interested, Evan said, but they want to know if you're willing to do publicity, interviews, book tours. Sarah thought about it, about standing in front of cameras and telling her story again, about facing the people who still didn't believe her. Not yet, she said. Maybe someday, but not yet. She'd testified at Claire's parole hearing last month. Claire had served 18 months and was asking for early release. Sarah stood before the board and said simply, "This woman helped my husband plan my murder. She knew he wanted me dead. She did nothing to stop it. She shouldn't be free." Claire was denied parole. She'd serve at least 5 more years. It was small justice. But Sarah had learned that justice usually came in small pieces. Detective Torres retired from the police force. She'd been forced out after the misconduct findings, even though everyone knew she'd been doing her job. Before she left, she came to see Sarah. "I should have believed you from the start," Torres said. "I'm sorry. You believed me eventually. That's more than most people." Torres handed her a file. "This is everything I gathered on the Cliff incident. All my notes, all my suspicions, everything. I can't prove it officially, but I know someone pushed you, and I know it was connected to Derek." Sarah took the file and added it to the growing collection of evidence that would never be enough. She kept it anyway. Maybe someday someone would care. Maybe someday it would matter. Her therapist said she was making progress. The nightmares had decreased from every night to a few times a week. She could sleep without medication now. She could drive past the cliff without having a panic attack. "You've survived something designed to destroy you," her therapist said. "That takes incredible strength." Sarah wasn't sure it was strength. Mostly it felt like stubbornness. A refusal to give Derek Mitchell the satisfaction of breaking her. She'd started dating someone, a social worker named Marcus who'd survived his own trauma. They moved slowly, carefully, both of them knowing how fragile trust could be. He never asked her to quit her job or change her clothes or check in constantly. He never monitored her phone or questioned her friends. He was just present, steady, safe. It was strange, learning what healthy love looked like after years of the other kind. On what would have been her baby's first birthday, Sarah drove to the cemetery where she'd placed a small memorial stone. No body to bury, but a place to visit nonetheless. She sat on the grass and talked to the child who never got to live, told him about the work she was doing, about the women she was helping, about choosing to make meaning from meaningless loss. "I think about you every day," she said. "I wonder who you would have been, what you would have looked like, if you would have had my eyes or your father's." The wind carried her words away. No answers came. They never did. But sitting there, talking to the memory of her child, Sarah felt something shift. Not healing exactly, but acceptance. This was her life now. This was who she'd become. Not the successful journalist she'd been. Not the naive wife she'd tried to be. Someone new. Someone forged in fire and ice and salt water. Someone who survived. 2 years after Derek's conviction, Sarah Mitchell stood in front of 300 people at a domestic violence conference in Los Angeles. She'd been invited to speak about her experience, about survival, about justice. She'd almost said no, but then she thought about all the women who'd contacted her nonprofit, all the stories that sounded like hers, all the voices that needed to be heard. So she said yes. The conference organizer introduced her as a survivor, advocate, and voice for women who weren't believed. Sarah took the stage, her hands only slightly shaking. "People ask me if it was worth it," she began. "If I'd do it again. The truth, I didn't want revenge. I wanted to survive." She told her story. Not all of it. Not the parts that still made her wake up gasping, but enough. Enough for the audience to understand what she'd lost and what she'd gained. "Derek Mitchell is in federal prison," she said. "He'll be there for at least 20 more years. That's a kind of justice. But it doesn't bring back my baby. It doesn't erase the trauma. It doesn't make the nightmares stop." She paused, looking out at the crowd. So many faces. So many people who knew exactly what she meant. "Justice isn't a happy ending," Sarah continued. "It's not closure. It's just accountability. And sometimes that has to be enough." The speech ended to standing ovation. Afterward, women lined up to talk to her, to share their stories, to ask for advice, to say thank you for believing them. One woman, young and terrified, whispered, "My husband says I'm crazy, that no one will believe me if I leave." Sarah took her hand. "I believe you, and I'll help you." That night, Sarah stood on her apartment balcony, looking out at the Oakland lights. She thought about the cliff, about falling, about the ocean that tried to swallow her. She thought about Derek in his prison cell, probably still convinced he was the victim of a vindictive wife. She thought about her baby, forever frozen at 7 months, never given the chance to become. And she thought about all the women she'd helped in the past 2 years, the ones who got out, the ones who survived, the ones who were rebuilding their lives piece by broken piece. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Miss Bott Mitchell, my name is Amanda. I saw your speech today. I think my husband is planning to kill me. Sarah closed her eyes and took a breath and said the words that had become her purpose. Tell me everything. I'll help you. Because this was who she was now. Not a victim, not a survivor waiting for her life to restart, but someone who'd learned that survival meant helping others survive. It wasn't the life she'd planned. It wasn't the happy ending people wanted for her story, but it was real. It was meaningful. It was hers. Sarah Mitchell had been pushed off a cliff by the man who promised to love her. She'd lost her baby. She'd lost her career. She'd lost her credibility and her safety and her innocence. But she hadn't lost herself. And in the end, maybe that was enough. She turned back to her laptop, Amanda's information already being entered into her case files. Another woman who needed help. Another story that deserved to be believed. The work continued. It always would. Because for every Derek Mitchell behind bars, there were 1,000 more out there. For every Sarah Mitchell who survived, there were too many who didn't. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. Real life rarely offered those, but it was an ending nonetheless. One where justice wore a complicated face, where victory came at a devastating cost, where healing meant learning to live with permanent scars. Sarah had survived what was designed to destroy her. She'd fought back against a system that didn't want to believe her. She'd built something meaningful from the ashes of her old life. Was it worth it? People still asked her that question. She still didn't have a good answer. Some nights, lying awake at 3 a.m, she thought about the life she could have had. The baby who would be 2 years old now. The career that might have flourished. The version of herself who never met Derek Mitchell. But that life was gone. This was the life she had, and she'd chosen to make it matter. That had to be enough, because the alternative was letting him win even from prison. And Sarah Mitchell had survived too much to give him that satisfaction. She closed her laptop. Tomorrow she'd help Amanda build her case. Tomorrow she'd face another board meeting for her nonprofit. Tomorrow she'd wake up and choose survival again. But tonight, she stood on her balcony and let herself feel it all. The grief, the rage, the exhaustion, the small, stubborn spark of hope that kept her moving forward. The ocean was miles away now. She couldn't hear the waves, but she remembered their sound, remembered falling into their embrace, remembered fighting her way back to shore. She'd survived the cliff. She'd survived the ocean. She'd survived Derek Mitchell. And she'd keep surviving. One day at a time, one woman helped. One story believed. It wasn't the ending anyone wanted, but it was the truth. And Sarah Mitchell had learned that sometimes the truth was all you had, so she held on to it, fierce and unbreakable. A survivor, an advocate, a voice for the women who weren't believed. That was who she'd become. That was who she'd remain. And somewhere in the darkness, that had to be enough. Sarah Mitchell's story doesn't end here. It continues every day in courtrooms, in safe houses, in the quiet conversations between survivors who finally found someone who believes them. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the voices we dismiss, about the women we don't believe, about the cost of survival, then I need you to do something. Hit that like button. Not for me, but because engagement tells the algorithm to show this story to someone who needs to hear it. Someone who might be Sarah Mitchell right now, thinking they're alone, thinking no one will believe them. Drop a comment below. Tell me what moment in this story hit you hardest. Tell me if you've seen this pattern in real life. Your comment keeps this conversation alive. It tells other viewers that this matters. Share this video. Because somewhere, someone is Googling whether their spouse is trying to kill them. Someone is wondering if they're crazy for feeling afraid. Your share might reach them. And subscribe to this channel. Because Sarah's story isn't unique. There are thousands of stories like hers. Stories of survival, of fighting back, of finding justice in a system designed to doubt you. I'll keep telling them if you keep listening. This channel is about more than true crime. It's about understanding power, manipulation, and the courage it takes to survive. It's about the stories that don't make headlines because the victim didn't die. They fought back. If you want to help survivors like Sarah, check the description below for links to domestic violence resources, to legal aid organizations, to nonprofits doing the real work. Remember, 847 cases like Sarah's are reported every year in America alone. Most women don't survive to tell their story. Sarah did.